We've had some spectacular fights this year, like Canelo Alvarez versus Jaime Munguia for the super middleweight titles, Naoya Inoue versus Louis Neri for Inoue's super bantamweight titles, and of course, Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk for all 4 heavyweight world titles. It's hard to imagine that all of these fights have happened, let alone in just 1 year, but it seems boxing is heading in the right direction with boxers actually fighting each other. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but a lot of these fights are possible because of the Saudis putting up massive amounts of money to have these fights happen. This is because by having these fights happen in Saudi Arabia, they're able to bring a lot of cultural development to their country. Now, why am I mentioning all of these big fights? Well, recently we had one of boxing's biggest pay-per-view stars, Javonte Davis, come out to have one of his best performances to date against Frank Martin. And whilst I was watching this, I realized that Tank's been dominating the top fighters at 135 pounds for a while. Tank is 29 years old and has been a world champion since he was 22. Since then, he's been fighting other world champions and high-level contenders, and he may have only been in 1 or 2 hard fights. He's performing like this in one of the hardest weight classes in history. The 135 to 140 pound weight classes have always been filled with the most physically gifted and dangerous fighters in history, like Shane Mosley, Henry Armstrong, Pernell Whitaker, and Roberto Duran. In today's era, it's no different, with fighters like Vasily Lomachenko, Shakur Stevenson, and William Cepeda, just to name a few. So in a weight class this dangerous, how was Gervonta Davis navigating it so successfully? In order to answer this question, I believe that we need to take a closer look at where it started for Gervonta Davis. Gervonta Davis was born and raised in Baltimore, one of the most crime-ridden cities in America. He's been boxing since he was 5 years old out of the Upton Boxing Center with coach Calvin Ford. He won multiple national titles as an amateur and finished his amateur career with an incredible 221 wins and 5 losses. He achieved all of this before he was even 18 years old. Once he turned 18, he became a professional and started racking up knockout wins. At just 22 years old, with a 17-0 record, he would challenge for his first world title against Jose Pedraza. Pedraza started out by giving Tank trouble with great head movement, but Tank eventually started landing combinations and knocked Pedraza out in the 7th round. He would defend this title a few times before challenging for the vacant WBA super featherweight belt. He defended this new title twice, knocking both opponents out before moving up to the lightweight division to fight for the WBA lightweight title. This was Tank's toughest fight up until then, going up against former world champion Yuriorkis Gamboa. Gamboa's hand speed and slick Cuban style gave Tank trouble in the early rounds, but once he started understanding Gamboa's rhythm, Gamboa was getting caught with heavy shots. Gamboa would try and put up a fight later on, but it was eventually stopped in the 12th round. He would then go on to face Leo Santa Cruz in one of his most memorable fights to this day, scoring one of the most devastating knockouts ever witnessed by perfectly placing an uppercut after slipping Leo's right hand. People after this fight were genuinely worried about whether Leo would wake up after this. Tank would then move up a weight class to the super lightweight division and face Mario Barrios for his WBA title. Mario is an incredible champion who uses his reach well and has great ability, but Tank slowly wore him down and eventually knocked him out in the 11th round. After this fight, Tank would go back to defending his lightweight title against Isaac Cruz. Now, Tank hurt his hand early into the fight and now found himself in a position where he couldn't unload any power to hurt Cruz. Most fighters would struggle to implement a game plan here, but Tank showed why he's a true champion and utilized his underrated back foot boxing to outbox Cruz comfortably and win by decision. Tank would then go on to defend his title against Rolly Romero, and all I can say about this fight was that it's a promoter's dream. Both boxers are characters, which made this entertaining, and Rolly also had good power, so there's always a chance that he could catch Tank and win the fight. Tank managed to accurately land a perfectly placed left hand to put Rolly on the canvas and stop the fight in the 6th round. Tank would then go on to defend his title again against a tough southpaw world champion called Hector Garcia by knocking him out in the 9th round before moving on to his biggest fight to this day against Ryan Garcia. Both of these fighters are the 2 biggest pay-per-view stars in the lightweight division, and people were giving Ryan a good chance at winning because of his size, reach, and power. Tank even said himself that he was afraid of Ryan after watching his knockout reels. Nevertheless, Tank managed to implement a good game plan and caught Ryan rushing in after he managed to avoid Ryan's left hook. He put Ryan down in the early rounds, then finished Ryan in the 7th round with a beautiful body shot. Fighters like Ryan with great frames and reach are very common in the weight class, and it seems like they would be the most successful. So how is it that someone who's only 5'5" and has a 67-inch reach so successful whilst having physical disadvantages? In order to answer this, I think we need to take a closer look at his style. Tank boxes from southpaw and switches between using a tight high guard to pressure and a Philly shell. Interestingly, on average, he only throws 33 punches per round. This leaves him at one of the lowest punch outputs in boxing, but to make up for this, he has one of the highest connect percentages, coming in at 35% of his punches. He throws explosive punches with a ridiculous amount of power. These stats show that it's his accuracy that leads to the knockouts. He places perfect punches which hit the vital spots to switch someone's lights off. He has a repertoire of punches as he tends to attack both the head and body, with his signature shot being the uppercut. He also has some of the best counter punching in boxing today. He takes his time, and eventually when he finds an opening, he capitalizes on it by throwing accurate and explosive counter punches. Perfect example of this would be in one of his signature shots against Rolly Romero. Rolly pressured Tank onto the ropes, and after throwing a right hand to the body, Tank countered by throwing a left hook to switch his lights off. Not only does he possess world-class pressure fighting, he's also great on the back foot as well. During his fight with Isaac Cruz, he had a problem with his hand which left him with only his lead hand. He switched to back foot boxing, and using his great footwork, he was able to avoid staying on the ropes and getting trapped. He put on a masterclass performance to win comfortably on points. Isaac Cruz would go on to become a world champion at super lightweight. Now Tank's definitely coming in on the shorter end of the weight class at only 5'5", but he's figured out a way to benefit from this. When he's pressuring, he will inch into range and slip or roll underneath punches. Because of his height, this isn't something that's hard for him to do, especially since he's already slightly crouched whilst in this stance. We saw this in his fight with Ryan Garcia, where Ryan kept looking to try and land his left hook. Tank capitalized on this by rolling underneath it and throwing punches over the top whilst Ryan still had his hands down. Recently, we saw one of his best career performances against Frank Martin. Frank is a good boxer with great technical ability and has Derek James in his corner, who's one of the best coaches in boxing right now. Before the fight, Tank was also just bullying Frank in the press conferences, saying he's from the suburbs and showing Frank's girl trying to message him as well. It was honestly one of the most one-sided press conferences I've ever seen. I also thought it was quite funny that Tank's team came in with Ghostbuster shirts because Frank Martin's nickname is the Ghost. Starting off the fight, Tank came in with a high guard and looked to pressure Frank straight away. Frank did a good job of picking his shots then moving, and Tank was hardly ever throwing anything. Even though Frank was picking up rounds, he was never really able to hurt Tank, and this showed through the middle of the fight where Tank was just walking straight in with no respect for Frank's power. Coming into the 7th round, Frank was starting to show fatigue and was staying on the ropes too long. Having to move around constantly and deal with Tank's pressure was wearing him down. Tank was inching closer and closer, and into the 8th round, he was finally able to corner Frank and catch him with an uppercut to daze him. He then finished him with a right hook and backhand. Throughout the fight, Tank was hardly ever throwing anything because he doesn't need to. 12 rounds is a lot of time to work for someone who only needs a second to knock anyone out. Although it was a great performance from Tank, I feel like we all expected this result because Frank Martin isn't on Tank's level. I'd like to see him in a true 50-50 fight, and I think the only two people in the weight class who can do this are Shakur Stevenson and Lomachenko. I feel like it's more likely that this fight gets made with Loma because Loma's been taking hard fights his entire career, and I think if Loma shows up at his best, this could end up being one of Tank's hardest fights in his career. Let me know what you guys think of Gervonta Tank Davis in the comments, and who do you guys want to see him fight next?